What happens when a careless claim of modern love gets turned into a courtroom weapon? I thought calling myself polygamous was daring and enlightened, but my husband quietly collected messages, photos, and timelines, and now he is posting proof online and preparing legal action. My so-called freedom became the evidence that destroyed my family. I am Vespera Quill, 34 years old, working as a library assistant, and I thought calling myself progressive meant I could defend anything as freedom. But I underestimated the weight of silence carried by my husband. Simon Quill, 37, is an IT manager who rarely raised his voice, who never fought in dramatic ways, but who turned his quiet into strength while I filled rooms with laughter at his expense. I told my sister Eileen that polygamy was the new wave, and she clapped, telling me I was ahead of my time, while his mother Irene glared and muttered that some women confuse selfishness with enlightenment. I brushed Irene off, believing everyone else admired me, especially Julian Ma, the photographer I spent afternoons with at cafes, convincing myself his smiles were validation. Our daughter Nola, only 9, heard enough whispers to ask why Daddy seemed upset when people mentioned Mommy's modern love, and I told her Daddy was just old-fashioned. I laughed at Simon's discomfort, called him insecure, and acted like I was the brave one. But in reality, he was gathering, storing, and preparing, while I was blind to the power of documentation. Now his quiet revenge has become public proof, and I am left exposed in ways I never thought possible. It began one evening at our book club, a place where I always felt like the star because people admired my bold opinions about love and life. The topic turned to relationships, and I said with pride that polygamy was modern love, a way of proving we had grown beyond the chains of tradition. Everyone chuckled or nodded politely, and I felt a rush of satisfaction, especially when Eileen laughed loudly, and told the group I was fearless for speaking the truth so openly. Simon sat stiff in his chair, saying nothing, while Irene's face hardened, her lips pressed tight like she wanted to leave immediately. I leaned back smug, thinking the silence meant victory, and afterward, I teased Simon that he needed to adapt to a changing world. At home, he barely responded, moving through the kitchen like my words had slipped past him, but I knew from his eyes that he had heard every syllable. Soon I began repeating the same line at dinners and gatherings, enjoying how it shocked people, enjoying the small bursts of attention it gave me. When friends asked if I was serious, I shrugged and said I was only telling the truth, and if Simon looked away, I told them he was shy about modern ideas. Eileen kept encouraging me, calling me brave, saying more women should speak openly, and I drank in her support like fuel. Irene confronted me once, asking if I realized how much I embarrassed her son, and I told her she was stuck in the past, that the world belonged to women like me now. I thought I had won, but Simon was already pulling away, staying longer at work, saving files to his laptop, and avoiding every confrontation. Around this time, Julian began joining me at the cafe near the library, and his easy charm made me feel justified, like my philosophy had weight, because someone outside my marriage seemed intrigued. I told myself it was innocent, that meeting him was part of living openly, that Simon had no right to complain if I was simply exploring modern love. When Simon asked why I was always late from work, I said the library demanded overtime. And when he raised an eyebrow, I accused him of doubting my dedication to my job. In truth, I knew he suspected, but he never pushed, and I mistook his silence for weakness rather than patience. The whispers started spreading when co-workers saw my posts online. Little captions about freedom and multiple loves, decorated with photos that looked playful but hinted at more. I told myself they admired me, that their whispers were jealousy, but I noticed how they began treating Simon differently at his office. He heard about the rumors before I admitted anything, and he came home one evening looking exhausted, saying nothing but stacking papers in a folder I assumed were work notes. I accused him of shutting me out, told Eileen that he was emotionally cold, and she agreed he was controlling. I wanted him to fight so I could play the victim, but he gave me nothing, only silence that stretched longer each day. At a family dinner, Irene finally spoke directly, telling Simon that he should protect himself because I clearly had no shame. I laughed and told everyone that older women fear change, but my laugh sounded hollow even to me. Simon excused himself quietly, left the table, and I thought it was weakness, but now I know he was finished with arguing. Elin defended me in front of the family, saying I was simply living honestly, and I basked in her support, not noticing how Simon's eyes stayed cold and unreadable. The final moment came when I saw him close the guest room door one night, carrying that same folder. I asked what he was doing, and he told me calmly that he was recording everything, and then he walked away. I tried to dismiss it, told myself he was bluffing, but a knot twisted in my stomach because for the first time I realized his silence had purpose. He was not weak, not sulking, but documenting every choice I made, while I laughed and believed my clever words would protect me. That night, for the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far, but by then, he already had more proof than I could undo. The weeks that followed felt strange, because Simon no longer argued with me, or even tried to ask questions. Instead, he acted like a man working through a private checklist, while I carried on with my so-called modern love philosophy. At first, I enjoyed the freedom, spending more time with Julian at cafes, convincing myself our connection was proof that I was living honestly while Simon clung to outdated rules. Julian listened politely when I spoke about polygamy, sometimes smiling, sometimes nodding, but I could tell he was uneasy when I mentioned Simon by name, and eventually he started excusing himself earlier, leaving me sitting alone with my coffee. I told myself he was busy with his photography clients, but deep down, I knew my chaos was spilling over into his world, and he wanted no part of it. At the library, co-workers no longer laughed when I brought up relationships. Instead, they whispered in corners and avoided long conversations with me. I noticed how quickly their eyes darted away whenever I mentioned Julian, and later, I overheard one of them telling another that Simon deserved better. The humiliation stung, but I told myself that small-minded people would never understand what bravery looked like. When I went home, I told Simon that people were gossiping because they envied me, and he only looked at me without a word, then returned to his laptop. That silence drove me mad, because I wanted him to fight, to yell, to make me feel like I mattered, but he refused, and in his refusal, he held all the power. I started posting more online, using captions about freedom and new kinds of love, believing I could build support by appearing fearless. Elin liked every post, sending me messages about how inspiring I was, and I leaned on her encouragement like proof that I was right. But the likes from others grew fewer, comments turned cautious, and soon I realized most people were avoiding me just as my coworkers did. When I showed Simon the posts, asking if he still thought I was lying, he said nothing, but I caught him taking a screenshot one evening when he thought I wasn't looking. Irene's presence in our lives grew louder, though she rarely spoke directly to me anymore. She spent more time with Nola, taking her for walks, helping with homework, filling her ears with stability while I was busy explaining my version of modern love. I told myself Irene was poisoning my daughter against me, but in truth, she was filling the gap that I had created by chasing attention instead of building peace at home. Nola began asking questions, small ones, like why people at school whispered when her father came to pick her up, or why her grandmother seemed so upset after dinners. I answered that grown-ups often misunderstood each other, but even a child could sense when words did not match reality, and I saw the doubt in her eyes. The turning point came when Simon placed a thick folder on the counter, sliding it toward me without expression. Inside were printed pages of my own posts, screenshots of messages with Julian, timestamps from social gatherings, even comments from friends that I had forgotten existed. The weight of the evidence was suffocating because it showed my entire narrative laid bare in black and white, stripped of the humor and sparkle I had tried to dress it in. I told Simon he was cruel for saving such things, that he was trying to trap me, but he only said it was necessary, and then left the room. I screamed after him that he was paranoid, that he was destroying his own family, but my voice felt small against the silence he left behind. When I told Elin about the folder, expecting her outrage, she hesitated for the first time, saying maybe Simon had a right to protect himself. Her hesitation felt like betrayal, because she had been my loudest supporter, Yet now, even she was pulling back. My mother tried to soothe me, saying Simon was being dramatic, but even she sounded unsure, as though she was beginning to accept his side of the story. I felt the ground shifting beneath me, the support I once leaned on crumbling away, while Simon's steady silence built something unbreakable. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of receipts, realizing that for all my words about freedom, I had handed him the tools of my own undoing. He did not need to invent anything or exaggerate, because my arrogance had already written the story for him. And while I still believed I was right in spirit, I could no longer deny that the evidence in his hands carried more weight than all the laughter and applause I had once collected. Simon's silence became heavier each day, but it was no longer the silence of a man retreating. It was the silence of someone who had already decided his course and no longer needed my words. He stopped sleeping in our room altogether, moving his things to the guest room, and though he left quietly each morning, I could sense the weight of his preparation in the way he checked his bag twice before leaving. I told myself he was sulking, that eventually he would tire of this charade and return to normal. But the truth was that he was sharpening every detail of his plan while I distracted myself with appearances. The first shock came through HR at the library. My supervisor called me into a meeting, saying there had been concerns raised about my online activity and how it reflected on the workplace. I felt my face flush because I knew instantly where it came from. Simon had shared the screenshots, pairing them with my job title, turning my freedom posts into a professional liability. I insisted to HR that I was only sharing philosophical ideas, not actions, but they pointed to specific posts with photos of Julian in the background and captions that implied more. I accused them of overreacting, of policing my personal life, but the polite firmness in their response made it clear they already viewed me as reckless. When I came home furious, I told Simon he was destroying my career out of spite, and he simply replied that he needed to protect his reputation, especially when our daughter's stability was at stake. I screamed that he was twisting everything, that he was making me look like a monster, but his calm face infuriated me even more because he did not need to raise his voice. He only had to let the evidence speak louder than my protests. Irene, of course, looked at me with triumph when she visited. She said Simon was handling things with dignity, and that I should be grateful he was not seeking worse consequences. I told her she was bitter and controlling, but inside I knew she was right that Simon had chosen the lawful path, and that made him untouchable. Even Elin stopped defending me openly, telling me during one phone call that maybe I should tone things down because Simon had clearly gathered more than enough proof. Her hesitation cut deep because she had once clapped for me at every outrageous comment, and now she was retreating into silence like everyone else. The next blow came when Simon's lawyer contacted me formally. A packet arrived with custody proposals, financial restrictions, and copies of the same evidence Simon had shown me before, now formatted neatly into legal arguments. I felt sick reading the words custody schedule and asset protection, because it meant he was no longer just collecting, he was acting. I told my mother that he was trying to erase me from my daughter's life, but she could not even look me in the eye while she said that maybe he only wanted to ensure Nola's well-being. That night, I sat with the papers spread across the kitchen table, trying to convince myself this was still a bluff, but the signatures at the bottom proved otherwise. Meanwhile, Simon continued posting carefully crafted updates on social media. They were never crude or angry, but each one carried receipts, screenshots of my captions, dated messages, and polite explanations of why he had chosen to move forward legally. The posts spread quickly, reshared by people who admired his composure, and the same friends who once cheered me online stopped interacting entirely. Julian stopped appearing in my life altogether, his silence confirming that he wanted no part in this spectacle. I tried to message him, but he never responded, and I knew Simon's posts had scared him away permanently. Each time I refreshed the feed and saw Simon's calm explanations paired with proof of my arrogance, I felt myself shrinking. I had wanted to be admired for my boldness, but now the community admired him for his patience, his strength, and his quiet refusal to fight dirty. I told myself over and over that my philosophy was not wrong, that polygamy really was modern love, but the evidence made me look less like a visionary and more like a reckless fool. The worst part was Nola. At school, other children had overheard enough that she came home one evening, asking why Daddy was showing people pictures of Mommy's phone. I told her it was complicated adult stuff, and that Daddy was being unfair, but the look on her face told me she believed him more than me. That night, when she asked to call him, even though she was staying at my house, I realized I was losing not just my husband's respect, but also my daughter's trust. And all of it stemmed from words I thought made me clever, but which Simon had turned into undeniable proof that I had mocked and dismissed the very life he had built with me. The day of mediation came, and I walked into the office believing I could charm the room, that if I smiled and spoke passionately about freedom, someone would finally understand me. But instead, I found Simon already seated with his lawyer, his binder of evidence stacked neatly beside him. The mediator explained that we would discuss custody, finances, and behavior moving forward. And I immediately said Simon was exaggerating, that my posts and comments were philosophical, not proof of betrayal. The mediator asked if I had considered how those words humiliated Simon in public, and I tried to laugh it off, saying only insecure men feel attacked by jokes, but no one in the room laughed with me. Simon's lawyer began reading from the folder, and hearing my own words spoken out loud, stripped of context, made my stomach twist. Captions about multiple loves were read like statements of fact. Screenshots of Julian in cafes beside me looked like admissions, and group messages where I mocked Simon's old-fashioned ways sounded crueler than I remembered. I said they were jokes, exaggerated for effect, but the mediator pointed out that repetition across months suggested consistency rather than humor. I felt cornered, and in my desperation, I accused Simon of trying to destroy me for being progressive, but he sat silently, his eyes fixed on the table, letting his lawyer speak for him. That silence made me feel smaller than any insult could have. When custody was discussed, Simon proposed an even split of time with Nola, with exchanges at school to avoid confrontation, and I shouted that he was trying to steal my daughter. The mediator reminded me that shared custody was fair and common, and that children benefit from stability. I argued that Simon's pride should not matter more than my love, but his lawyer calmly replied that Simon's actions showed responsibility, while my words showed recklessness. Even my mother, who came to support me, sat silently during the session, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine. The financial terms hit harder. Simon had already filed to freeze our joint accounts and move his salary into a new one, and his lawyer explained that this was a protective measure, not punishment. I insisted it was cruel, that he was leaving me with nothing, but the mediator said it was standard practice during separation. I turned to my mother, begging her to speak, but she only whispered that maybe I should consider compromising. It was the first time I realized even she no longer believed fully in my innocence. When the mediation ended, Simon stood, thanked the mediator politely, and left with his lawyer without looking back at me. The folder of evidence remained in my memory. Page after page of my own arrogance turned against me, and I realized how powerless I was against documentation. Outside the office, Irene hugged Simon, praising him for his calmness, while Nola clung to his side, asking if he was finished with his important work. The sight of my daughter looking proud of her father while ignoring me burned worse than any legal paper. That evening, Simon posted again on social media, but this time it was not just screenshots. It was a calm explanation that he had chosen lawful steps to protect his child and his dignity, paired with proof that showed my repeated behavior. Friends who once cheered for me online commented under his post, telling him they respected his strength, and I watched helplessly as the small amount of support I still had disappeared. Elin didn't even message me this time, and I knew she had decided to quietly distance herself rather than defend me again. Julian's name was never mentioned, but I knew he had seen it too, and his silence confirmed that he would never return. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone, scrolling through the comments, watching people I had once considered allies side with Simon, admiring his dignity while calling my words selfish and cruel. I told myself they didn't understand, that they were all trapped in old traditions, but the truth was impossible to ignore. My husband had turned my philosophy into a weapon, and I had handed him every blade myself. The silence of his strategy, the calmness of his lawful revenge, and the weight of his evidence had crushed me more completely than anger ever could. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, not because of the temperature, but because of the way everything inside was so formal, structured, and indifferent to my explanations. I thought if I spoke passionately about freedom and love, maybe someone would see me as brave, but the judge was only interested in documents, in dates, in receipts. Simon's lawyer laid out the binder like a map, each section tabbed neatly, each screenshot printed and time-stamped, and hearing my own words read aloud again made me shrink in my seat. I said they were jokes, that modern love was not a crime, but the judge reminded me that this was not about criminality. It was about dignity, custody, and financial security. Simon never raised his voice, never accused me directly. He simply nodded when his lawyer spoke, and that calmness earned respect from everyone present. My lawyer tried to argue that Simon was using social media to shame me, but the judge pointed out that his posts were factual, restrained, and paired with legal filings, not slander. I felt my face burn because I realized Simon had outmaneuvered me completely, building his case not with rage, but with quiet patience. The custody ruling came first, granting equal time, but with exchanges at school or Irene's house to avoid conflict. I wanted to protest, to claim that Nola needed me more, but the judge noted that Simon had demonstrated consistency and stability while I had chosen to undermine him publicly. Financial orders followed, freezing assets and assigning temporary control of major accounts to Simon, and I nearly gasped at how final it sounded. My protests seemed desperate, weak against the weight of neat signatures and sealed papers. When the gavel struck, Simon stood and thanked the court staff politely, then left the room with his lawyer, while Irene waited outside, holding Nola's hand. My daughter's face lit up when she saw him, and I felt invisible standing there, with my mother who avoided my eyes. The respect Simon commanded in that moment was undeniable, and I hated him for it, even as I envied it. Later that evening, he posted once more, a calm statement explaining that the court had finalized arrangements and that he hoped for peace moving forward. Attached were blurred versions of the same evidence, enough to remind everyone of my actions without violating privacy, and the comments filled with admiration for his restraint. Friends who had once cheered me online were gone, replaced with voices praising his dignity and strength. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, realizing that my laughter, my pride, my claims of modern love had become the very noose that tightened around me. Simon had won without shouting, without threats, without breaking the law. He had chosen silence, patience, and proof, and in the end, that was stronger than all the noise I ever made. The house was quiet around me, stripped of laughter, stripped of certainty, leaving only the echo of my own words that had undone everything I thought I controlled. The days after the court ruling blurred together, each one shaped by the consequences written in those documents that Simon carried out with steady precision. The custody schedule dictated when I saw Nola, and even though it was technically equal, it felt like I had lost because every exchange happened on Simon's terms. At school pickups, he stood calm and collected, greeting teachers with polite warmth while I lingered awkwardly at the edge, sensing how people looked at him with admiration and at me with quiet judgment. Nola smiled when she saw me, but her first words were always about what Daddy had said or what Daddy had planned, and I felt myself shrinking in her eyes. At work, the whispers never faded, even though HR said the matter was closed. Colleagues avoided conversations with me, choosing instead to praise Simon for how respectfully he had handled everything online. I overheard one saying that at least he was not bitter, that he was protecting his daughter instead of dragging things through endless fights. Hearing that made me furious because I wanted someone, anyone, to admit that I had a point, but the more I insisted, the less anyone believed me. Julian had vanished completely. No replies, no sightings, leaving me humiliated by the realization that he had been nothing more than a fleeting distraction. My sister Elin no longer defended me either. She still answered calls, but her voice was short, her excuses constant, and eventually, I stopped reaching out because I could not bear to hear her hesitation. My mother tried to remain supportive, saying Simon had been too harsh, but even she spoke more softly now, like she was no longer certain of her own words. Irene, on the other hand, seemed to grow prouder each day, walking with Simon and Nola at school events, her head held high, as if the entire outcome proved her right from the beginning. Online, Simon's posts still lingered, reshared by others, praised for their calm tone and measured evidence. I wanted to believe people would tire of them, that eventually they would move on. But each time I checked, the comments were still there, filled with respect for him and pity for Nola. Not once did anyone call me brave for speaking about modern love. Not once did anyone admire my honesty. And I realized the narrative had escaped my hands completely. At night, the house felt unbearably empty, stripped of the noise I once mocked as boring, leaving only silence that pressed against me like judgment. I replayed the moments in my head, the book club comments, the captions I posted, the jokes I made at dinners, and each one now sounded cruel and careless instead of clever. I told myself I had only wanted freedom, but the truth was I had wanted attention, and Simon had given me the freedom I claimed to desire by walking away with dignity, leaving me alone with nothing but consequences. The final blow came one evening when I refreshed Simon's profile and saw a photo of him holding Nola's hand outside the courthouse, smiling calmly while she beamed at him. His caption said simply that he was grateful for closure and ready to move forward. The comments overflowed with praise, calling him strong, patient, and admirable. I stared at the screen until tears blurred the words, realizing that he had written the ending of our story in plain sight, and I had no voice left to counter it. My so-called modern love had been reduced to a cautionary tale, one that everyone else now shared as proof of his dignity and my downfall. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching, 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 watching.